Okay, so we are now looking at John Corvino's essay, Why Shouldn't Tommy and Jim Have Sex? He introduces Tommy and Jim to us. He says Tommy and Jim have been together for 14 years. They're in their 40s. They're professionals. They live together in a house. They restored themselves. Why shouldn't they have sex? After all, sex is pleasurable and has many emotional benefits. They clearly have a reason to have sex. Maybe there's an even stronger reason for them not to. Okay, so that's his introduction. I think in one sense it's a little misleading, or he's trying to make an emotional appeal, like these are good people, but I think that introduction maybe masks the question of whether two random people shouldn't have sex on the street if they're men. If they meet in a bar one night and they want to have sex with each other. So I think the introduction's a little misleading, because that's not just the issue, but he's saying that's more about marriage, maybe, gay marriage. But anyhow, that's how he starts off the essay. And it's not relevant to the arguments he makes, but it's just, I think, worth noting. So Corvino, he looks at 5 arguments against homosexuality. The first is that homosexual sex is unnatural. Second is that it's harmful. Third is that it violates biblical teachings. Fourth is that it goes against a traditional conception of marriage and sex. And the fifth is that it will lead to polygamy, incest, bestiality, etc. Okay, so first argument, that homosexual sex is unnatural. So he tries to parse what that means, right? So he says, well, many things that people think are good, like modern medicine, are unnatural, and many things that people think are bad, like disease, suffering, and death, are natural. So it's hard to see how something being not natural makes it bad when that's not a normal view in a lot of cases. Well, maybe it means abnormal. So heterosexual sex is statistically more common, right? So people and homosexual sex or homosexuality is statistically less common, less normal in that sense. But not all things that are statistically uncommon are morally wrong, right? So he mentions breeding goats and learning Sanskrit. Those things are not morally wrong just because most people don't do them. Okay, what about what other species do? But other species do have homosexual sex. I think the one that comes closest to what people might be thinking in this argument is that what violates an organ's purpose is unnatural. And really this idea of natural goes back to sort of early conceptions of morality. That morality is sort of teleological conceptions of morality. Go back to ancient Greece, that everything has a purpose in the universe, and Christianity very much sort of adopted this view. Everything has a purpose, it's connected to God, and the purpose of sexual organs is procreation and sex between a man and a woman, things like that. Now, if you endorse a teleological conception of the universe, or religious conception of the universe, that argument makes perfect sense. If you don't, then that argument doesn't really make any sense at all. And the other point to note about that is that a lot of heterosexual sex involves things that are unnatural, oral sex, anal sex, things like that. And even just sex for pleasure, regular sex for pleasure, you might think is unnatural in some sense. Certainly does involve procreation. Okay, so we can't really make much sense of that outside of a religious context. And if we're doing philosophy, that doesn't help us. So moving on, in terms of trying to find a rational argument against why Tommy and Jim shouldn't have sex, the most useful, fruitful point of discussion, if you're going to find an argument against why gay marriage or homosexuality is wrong, is going to have to be the notion that it's harmful in some way or another, right? So all our theories, our moral theories, whether social contract theory or utilitarianism, they're related to this idea of harm, suffering, hurting other people, right? According to social contract theory, something isn't wrong as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. But then when it hurts other people, harms other people, then we have a right to regulate it, restrict it, things like that. Of course, utilitarianism, if there's some harm involved, then it's directly morally wrong. Okay, so is homosexuality harmful in some way? So he looks at the notion that he mentions that homosexuality amongst people that are gay. There's higher rates of sexual promiscuity, depression, suicide, and AIDS. He gives some statistical disclaimers around that. But I guess, more important thing is that, mountain climbers have higher risk of dying than non-mountain climbers. Doesn't mean that mountain climbing is morally wrong, just for example. Statistics is very complicated in looking at those things, which we won't talk about. But the point is, even if something harms yourself, it's not morally wrong, as we saw with the case of drug addiction, drug use, or drug decriminalization arguments there. And there has to be harm to other people in society, because you're allowed to do whatever you want, even if it harms yourself, but you're not allowed to harm other people. So one argument in terms of harming other people is that homosexuality threatens children. So you might think that gay people are pedophiles, but the truth is the vast majority of child abuse is perpetrated against women by their fathers and stepfathers and relatives. And there's not evidence that there's a higher percentage of pedophiles among the gay population, or and he says even if there is, that doesn't reflect on the fact that gay people are not child abusers. There's no sort of reason to sanction them, because some people are gay or child abusers, just like there's no reason to sanction heterosexual males because they're child abusers. So there's no real evidence that, of course, I think part of one thing that's missing from the essay is discussing the question of, well, what about children raised by gay parents? That's a separate topic, which he doesn't talk about. As far as I've seen, there's no evidence to suggest that people that are raised by gay parents are harmed, or children that are raised by gay parents are harmed in any way. But that could be one route to take if you want to examine that evidence. Closer to that notion is that homosexuality threatens society. Again, I think Corvino's argument here, it's a good point to discuss. His argument's a little, I think, misses the point slightly. He says he understands this to mean that if everyone were gay, society couldn't continue. So in that sense, it harms society. But I think a more crucial question, or more that most people who are conservative and against gay marriage, is that it sort of undermines the traditional family structure. If traditional family structure is undermined, children are harmed, things like that. That's a very hard question to assess. Does gay marriage harm families that are not gay? Does it undermine faith in the institution of marriage? Does that thereby harm children? Those are slippery slope. That's a kind of a slippery slope argument, which, until good evidence is provided for, we don't have a reason to believe it's true. It's a conjecture, it's a theory, it's a speculation, but there's no real evidence for it in that direction. So what you're essentially saying, if you make that argument, is we should take away these people's right to live their life how we want based on this idea that we think it will harm people in society. But if you don't have evidence that there's direct harm being done, that's a tough position to take. And you can make the same argument about lots of other things, right? So I could say you playing video games all day in your house harms society, or you not voting harms society. You choosing to drop out of college harms society. Your religion harms society. So you can't really outlaw something based on some vague notion of harm to society. The things that are truly illegal that we outlaw are things in which harm is clear and direct, in which we know harm society. All right. The next argument is that homosexual sex violates biblical teaching, and I think the argument here, again, is it's an important point to raise. I think he raises the right points, but I think his argumentation misses the point a little bit. So his point is that he says, well, yeah, the Bible also forbids touching dead pigs and condones slavery and genocide. He says believers must interpret biblical teachings in their historical context. I think that's not the right approach. So he's trying to tell believers how to interpret the Bible. And that is one approach, and that's a discussion that is ongoing within various religions and within various churches. Some churches are okay with homosexuality, some are not. Some Christians are gay. They make arguments within the Christian tradition. As a philosopher, I don't think that really has anything to do with what our interest in gay marriage, right? So we're looking at this from a rational perspective, from perspective what laws should we have, what types of arguments can be made. So the argument that homosexuality violates biblical teachings, true or not true, neither here nor there from my perspective, from a philosophical perspective. But it is true from a philosophical perspective, from a social contract theory perspective, that we can't have laws based on biblical teaching, right? Separation of church and state. That's the basic foundation of social organization and government since the time of the Enlightenment. So we can't base our laws on biblical teaching or the teachings of the Quran or any scriptural teaching, right? We have laws based on the common good, what maximize utility, things like that. So that argument is not an argument that holds any water in terms of whether we're thinking homosexuality or gay marriage should be legal or not. And I think his approach in terms of trying to tell believers how to interpret the Bible is one to let believers sort out amongst themselves. It's not necessarily relevant to whether we should have gay marriage or not in terms of a law. Okay, so homosexual sex will lead to polygamy, incest, and bestiality. Author correctly notes that this is a slippery slope argument as it stands without some sort of evidence or statistics to back it up. There's no reason to think it will lead to those things other than a conjecture. So without evidence, it's merely a slippery slope argument. Slippery slope arguments are not valid. You can't simply say this will lead to this without providing evidence for it. Okay, next argument, homosexual sex goes against a traditional conception of marriage. Okay, this is true, but it's not a good argument because interracial marriages went against a traditional conception of marriage, right? Divorce went against a traditional conception of marriage. Marriage between one man and one woman went against a traditional conception of marriage. So the traditional conception of marriage has involved all kinds of things. Monogamy goes against a traditional conception of marriage. So that's not really a good argument, and in general, arguments from tradition are not sort of tradition, culture, going back to our first unit. That's not how we decide things. We decide things based on reason, evidence. So that argument isn't one that's useful to philosophers because we're not necessarily concerned with tradition. We're concerned with providing arguments. Can you provide a good argument for your tradition? If you can, it's a useful tradition. It's one we ought to accept. If you can't, then it's not a tradition we ought to accept. All right, so he concludes, Tommy and Jim's relationship, far from being a moral abomination, is exactly what it appears to be to those who know them, a morally positive influence on their lives and others. Accepting this conclusion takes courage, since it entails that our moral traditions are fallible. But when these traditions interfere with people's happiness for no sound reason, they defeat what is arguably the very point of morality, promoting individual and communal well-being. Put the argument simply, Tommy and Jim's relationship makes them better people, and that's not just good for Tommy and Jim, that's good for everyone. Okay, that is the argument for gay marriage, or for why Tommy and Jim should be allowed to have sex. Of course, it's worth noting at this point that gay marriage is currently legal in the United States after a period of struggle on this issue, so if that holds up and continues to hold up, it seems like somewhat of a settled issue, but still contentious one politically. There's still a divided opinion on it. Okay, thanks.